It all began quietly, almost too subtly for me to notice at first. Our family had always been close, a tight-knit unit of shared laughter and moments, bound by love that felt unbreakable. My older sister, Rebecca, had just turned 18, and something imperceptible but significant began to change with our father. At first, it was merely a feeling, a sense of difference that seemed to color the room whenever we were all together. My dad, who'd always been our rock, the steady hand who held us all up, started to shift his focus in a way I couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the way he looked at Rebecca, or the way his attention gravitated toward her even during casual conversations, as though he were seeing her in a new, different light. Rebecca, for her part, seemed oblivious. She was basking in the newfound freedoms that came with adulthood, wrapped up in dreams of college and adventures beyond the walls of our home. But in those quiet moments when it was just the family, I felt the subtle, almost imperceptible tension growing. Dad would watch her with an intensity that didn't feel quite paternal. The change was gradual, and I kept brushing off the strange feelings it stirred in me. After all, Dad was the one who had been there through everything. Scraped knees, childhood tantrums, and teenage heartbreaks. He was the man who protected us from the world, a figure so steadfast that I had never questioned his love. Then, one evening after Rebecca's 18th birthday party, I saw it more clearly. Rebecca was laughing, carefree, her friends gathered around her. I noticed Dad standing off to the side, watching her with an expression I couldn't quite read. His gaze held a strange pride, but there was something more there, something that made me feel uneasy. The room felt heavy, the air charged with an energy that seemed to shift and pull, and I caught my mom's eyes from across the room. She looked uncomfortable, her smile strained. She noticed too. Days passed, but the subtle tension only grew. Dad began finding excuses to spend more time with Rebecca. When they'd sit together, there was a warmth in his voice that was more tender, more lingering than before. He'd laugh at her jokes with a spark in his eyes, the kind that used to be reserved for my mother. And my mother, I could tell, was starting to grow wary. She'd watch their exchanges with a careful eye, her gaze darkening whenever Dad leaned in a bit too close, his attention fixed too intently on Rebecca. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew something was wrong. I felt caught between them, unsure of what to do or say, and terrified that voicing my feelings might only deepen the growing rift. I loved my family, all of us, and I wanted us to stay the way we'd always been. But with each passing day, that warm cocoon of family love felt as if it was slowly, steadily unraveling. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I heard the muffled sound of voices in the living room. I tiptoed down the hall and stopped just before reaching the doorway, listening to the sharp exchange between my parents. My mother's voice was low and trembling, a sound I'd rarely heard from her before. "You're spending so much time with her, Richard," she was saying, her words laced with a hint of accusation. "Have you even noticed how distant you've become?" Dad's reply was quiet, almost defensive. "She's my daughter, Linda. You're making this something it isn't." But my mother didn't relent. "Maybe I am, but I know what I see and what I feel. And I don't think I'm the only one who's noticed. The way you look at her, Richard, it's not normal." Their voices faded as I hurried back to my room, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to make of their conversation, but the quiet tension that I had felt was now spoken aloud, a crack that threatened the foundation of our family. I felt torn, unable to shake the feeling that I was caught in something I didn't fully understand, yet afraid of what would happen if I tried to pull away. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic in our home shifted even more. My mother grew increasingly withdrawn, her voice clipped and her laughter forced whenever we all sat down for dinner. And Dad? He was attentive, more present than ever, but there was something different in his attention, a weight that made me feel more like a spectator in my own family than a part of it. My aunt's visit was a big deal. Every year, like clockwork, she'd come and stay for a week or two, bringing stories and little gifts that lit up our lives, if only for a while. Mom adored her sister, and I think it was one of the few times she truly relaxed, like she was finally with someone who understood her in ways we couldn't. This year, her arrival seemed to come at the perfect time, adding a new kind of energy to the house that offered a welcome distraction. While they were together, Mom was constantly wrapped up in laughter, late-night chats, and endless cups of tea with Auntie in the kitchen. There was an ease between them that was beautiful to see, like the bond between sisters was the strongest thing in the world, unbreakable and sure. But amid all the joy and chatter, there was something darkly unsettling growing elsewhere in our home. As Mom became more absorbed in her sister's visit, Dad took the opportunity to become even more attentive to Rebecca. I didn't want to see it, didn't want to believe that it meant anything unusual, but it was impossible to ignore. Dad began filling the gaps in ways that felt strange, ways that I couldn't explain but felt too intensely to dismiss. He'd linger when Rebecca was around, hanging on her every word and complimenting her on things he'd never noticed before. "You're really growing up, Rebecca," he'd say, his eyes watching her in a way that didn't feel quite right. I saw how he would brush a strand of hair from her face or place a hand on her shoulder, gestures that might seem innocent but felt wrong. Too familiar, too close. The moments felt increasingly charged. Every time I saw them together, an uncomfortable knot twisted in my stomach, an instinctive sense that something wasn't as it should be. When Mom and Auntie weren't around, Dad would find little ways to keep Rebecca close. He'd invite her to watch a movie with him, claiming it was one of his old favorites. She'd laugh it off, caught up in her own world, probably chalking it up to her new adult status. But I could see it clearly. Each shared glance, each lingering moment between them built up like layers of static electricity in the air, waiting to spark. The more time they spent together, the less it felt like a father and daughter sharing simple moments. I wanted to talk to Mom, but how could I? She was finally letting go of the stress that had seemed to hang over her for weeks, diving into the familiar comfort of her sister's company. Every time I thought about bringing it up, a voice in my head whispered, "What would you even say?" So I stayed silent, hoping maybe it would all blow over, that once Auntie left, things would go back to the way they used to be. Maybe it was just my imagination and overreaction, a worry twisted up by the tension I'd felt between my parents lately. Then one night, Auntie suggested they go out for a girls' night, just her and Mom. Mom's face lit up as she agreed, her eyes shining with a kind of happiness I hadn't seen in a long time. She seemed almost giddy, maybe grateful for a chance to escape everything for an evening. She didn't even look back as she left with her sister, both of them laughing as they walked down the steps and out the door. That left Dad, Rebecca, and me alone in the house. I tried to busy myself in my room, thinking maybe if I gave them space, I wouldn't have to see the things I was afraid of. But curiosity, or maybe some deeper sense of protectiveness, got the best of me. Quietly, I made my way downstairs and found them on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background. Rebecca was leaning against the arm of the couch, her legs tucked under her, and Dad sat beside her, just a little too close. They weren't talking much, just watching the screen, but his arm was draped over the back of the couch, his fingers almost brushing her shoulder. And the way he looked at her, it made my skin crawl. There was an intensity in his gaze, a focus that didn't feel like it belonged between a father and his daughter. I could feel my pulse quicken, the room feeling suddenly too warm, too charged. Part of me wanted to interrupt them, to break whatever quiet bond had formed in the living room. But another part of me, the part that felt too small and afraid, held me back. Instead, I cleared my throat softly, just enough to catch their attention. They both turned to look at me, and Dad quickly pulled his arm back, as if he hadn't even noticed how close he'd been. Rebecca gave me a lazy smile, not noticing the tension simmering between us. "Hey," she said, looking unbothered. "Want to watch with us?" I shook my head, my voice coming out barely above a whisper. "No, I think I'm just going to go to bed early." Dad's eyes lingered on me for a moment, unreadable. "Good night, sweetie," he said, his tone soft, almost too soft. There was something in his voice that made my heart ache, a reminder of the warmth he used to save for all of us, not just one. As I walked back to my room, I felt my hands shake, the growing awareness of how far things had shifted within our family. In the weeks that followed Auntie's visit, I couldn't shake the sense of unease growing inside me. I knew in my gut that something was wrong, that the closeness between my dad and Rebecca wasn't normal. But every time I tried to put it into words, the words crumbled in my mouth, too heavy and strange to say out loud. How could I tell anyone about what I'd seen, or, even worse, about what I felt might be happening? It started with simple, almost unnoticeable things. Dad would ask her to join him on errands that used to be family trips, taking her along as if they were the only two in the house. Or he'd call her into his study, shutting the door behind them for long talks that never included anyone else. They'd spend hours together, and when they finally rejoined the family, Rebecca looked different. Her face would glow with that warm, contented look people wear when they're cherished, and Dad's gaze softened whenever it landed on her, his pride all too obvious. I wanted to think it was all in my head, that maybe I was seeing something twisted by my own fears. But then I started to notice how Rebecca seemed drawn to him, too. If he entered a room, her face would brighten, her attention snapping to him as if he were the only one who mattered. She'd laugh at his jokes, playfully swatting his arm, and sometimes, if he looked at her too long, a light blush would rise in her cheeks. One night at dinner, as we all sat around the table, the unspoken tension was thicker than ever. Rebecca and Dad were deep in conversation, their voices dipping low, sharing jokes that made them lean in just a little too close. I could see Mom watching them, her gaze sharpening as she sipped her wine, her face betraying nothing but her eyes. Her eyes were filled with a hurt I hadn't seen before. I could hardly eat, my appetite gone as I watched this bizarre dynamic unfolding right in front of us. Dad and Rebecca seemed almost to forget we were there, wrapped up in their own world. And when Rebecca laughed at something he said, throwing her head back in that carefree way she used to when we were kids, Dad's hand reached over to rest on her arm, a lingering touch that lasted a heartbeat too long. Mom put her fork down, her hand tightening on her napkin. She didn't say anything, just kept her eyes locked on Dad, her silence loaded with accusation. Dad must have felt it because he finally glanced up, meeting her gaze for a brief second before quickly looking away, guilt flashing in his eyes. But Rebecca, oblivious to the turmoil building around her, just kept smiling. After dinner, I waited until everyone had gone their separate ways before slipping into Rebecca's room. She was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair, and looked surprised to see me. "Nancy," she said, smiling, "what's up?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Rebecca, have you noticed you and Dad have been spending a lot of time together lately?" She laughed, brushing off my concern as if it were nothing. "What's wrong with that? We're just close, you know. I'm 18 now. I think he's just trying to be there for me more like a friend." She said it with such innocence, her eyes wide and genuine, and for a second, I almost believed her. But then I remembered the way he'd looked at her, how his hand had lingered on her arm, the subtle shift in his demeanor that had started months ago. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him wanting to be a good father. There was something darker, something that felt as wrong as it was real. "Rebecca," I began carefully, choosing my words, "don't you think it's different, though? The way he looks at you, the way he's around you all the time." She frowned, putting her brush down, her tone turning defensive. "Are you saying there's something wrong with me being close to my dad? He's always been there for us, and now that I'm older, I can finally appreciate it. Why are you acting so weird about this?" I felt my cheeks burn with shame, the accusation in her voice making me feel as if I'd done something terrible by even bringing it up. But I couldn't ignore the instinct screaming at me that this wasn't normal, that it was wrong, no matter how she tried to explain it away. "Never mind," I mumbled, retreating from her room, feeling more confused and helpless than before. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt, but how could I explain it to someone who didn't want to see it? The days that followed were tense. Mom, noticing the shift in Rebecca and Dad, grew quieter, watching them both with a guarded look in her eyes. There was a fragile silence between my parents that seemed to hang over everything, casting a shadow over our once warm and open home. And Dad, sensing the tension but unable or unwilling to stop his behavior, kept finding excuses to be near Rebecca, as if their closeness was something he couldn't or wouldn't resist. One evening, when Mom and I were alone, I felt her eyes on me, her gaze heavy with questions she didn't want to voice. She sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat as she looked down at the floor, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nancy," she said softly, "have you noticed the way things have changed between your father and Rebecca?" Her words were a relief and a curse all at once. I wasn't alone in seeing it. I hadn't imagined it. But the fact that Mom had noticed too meant that this wasn't going to go away. It was real, and it was hurting us all. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "I've noticed," I admitted, my voice trembling. "It feels wrong, doesn't it?" She nodded, her face shadowed with a sadness I didn't know how to fix. Yes, she whispered. It's been tearing me apart, seeing them like this. I thought it was just in my head, that maybe I was being paranoid, but I don't know what to do anymore, Nancy. The raw honesty in her voice shattered something inside me. I wanted to tell her everything, but at that moment, I realized how fragile we all were, how close we were to breaking. If I said too much, if I added fuel to the fire, our family might never be the same. I reached out, taking her hand, squeezing it gently, as if I could somehow comfort her. I don't know either, Mom, I whispered, my voice filled with the helplessness we both shared. But I'm scared for all of us. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over us both, an unspoken understanding that this dark shadow hanging over our family wasn't something we could ignore. As much as we loved each other, there was something here that might be too powerful to control, a force that could tear us apart if we weren't careful. And for the first time, I felt truly afraid, not just of what I'd seen, but of what it meant for all of us.